Hi, general psychology students. In this lecture, we're going to talk about classical conditioning, and I'm going to describe 3 real-life situations where classical conditioning occurs and thereby changes our behaviors. And it is time for some real talk because we're going to discuss drug use and addiction, chronic illness, and post-traumatic stress. So first we'll examine drug use, and I'm going to use marijuana as an example. So one of the reasons, perhaps, why people become addicted is because there's a classical conditioning property that's happening. So in this case, marijuana is the unconditioned stimulus because you don't have to learn how to get high on marijuana. If you use it, your body will have a naturally occurring response to the stimulus of marijuana. And that naturally occurring response is the unconditioned response, and this is getting high. And thus far, we haven't discussed learning. These are all naturally occurring responses that don't require any previous learning or conditioning or pairing for it to happen. Now, when somebody uses a drug, there's usually a lot of other stimuli that could be paired with the unconditioned stimulus of the drug. For instance, it could be things that are used with the drug, so some paraphernalia like a pipe or a grinder or vaporizer, etc. It could also be a mood or a state of mind. So the conditioned stimulus could be a feeling of boredom if a person tends to smoke when they feel bored. Or it could be other people if a person uses their drug always with certain friends. So it doesn't always have to be a thing, this conditioned stimulus. But the conditioned stimulus is the stimulus that's present during drug use, so when the UCS is also present. And then it comes to elicit a conditioned response. And in the case of drug use, the conditioned response tends to be craving or a desire for the drug. So when a person maybe sees their favorite pipe or some other paraphernalia that they always use, they might have the urge to smoke marijuana. Or if a person starts to feel bored, their body might respond with this conditioned response of craving marijuana. So to recap with drug use, one of the ways that we see classical conditioning is that the UCS, the unconditioned stimulus, is the drug. The unconditioned response is getting high. Then the conditioned stimulus is anything that is paired with the drug use. So this would be paraphernalia, mood states, time of day, different people who are paired with the drug use. And finally, the conditioned response is craving or desire to use when presented with those conditioned stimuli. Now in my second example, we're going to look at chronic illness and classical conditioning. And we're going to see how classical conditioning was used to help a girl with lupus. And this is a case study. So an 11-year-old girl, whose name was Jenna, was diagnosed with lupus, which is a painful and chronic autoimmune disorder. The drug treatments for lupus are steroids, which have some serious negative side effects, including weight gain and mood imbalances. Jenna was struggling with these side effects and had become very withdrawn and self-conscious and depressed. And her doctors wanted to be able to lower her steroid dose so that she could reduce those side effects, but they wanted to keep the therapeutic effect of the steroids. So what they decided to do was try a classical conditioning strategy. They paired her steroid, the drug that actually does cause an effect, it fights the lupus. They paired that with a very bitter flavor. And they did this pairing over and over and over. So they paired the unconditioned stimulus of the steroid with what they were hoping would become a conditioned stimulus, the bitter flavor. So the steroid's unconditioned response is a physiological response of fighting the lupus. And then what happened with Jenna, amazingly, is that the bitter flavor came to have that same response. So the conditioned response to the bitter flavor was fighting the lupus. So her immune system kicked in. And what's really impressive is that her doctors were able to reduce her dose of steroids and keep pairing this bitter flavor for her, and her body was fighting the lupus as if it was on the full dose of steroids. However, she got a reduction in her side effects and reported that she felt much more engaged, better able to succeed at school, and have some meaningful friendships while she was fighting lupus. And the final one we're going to talk about is post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. And this disorder develops after a traumatic event and includes symptoms of severe anxiety, flashbacks to the trauma, and always being alert or on edge. This is called hypervigilance. I'm going to share about a former client of mine who was raped and developed some symptoms of PTSD and also what appeared to be a conditioned response of anxiety after this assault. So she was a college student, and she was raped by a male student who was known to her. And after the assault, she found that she would panic frequently, and to her it seemed like it came out of nowhere. She had no warning that she would have a panic response. She would be out on the quad and then panic, or she'd be at the grocery store and panic. Because this felt so out of control for her, she wanted to figure out how to manage the panic, or at least how to anticipate it and then help herself reduce the panic effect. So what we did was we processed through her rape experience to see if there were any triggers, or if we're using classical conditioning terms, to see if there were any conditioned stimuli that were present during the assault that were now causing her to have the conditioned response of panic. So in this case, the unconditioned stimulus is the rape, because you don't have to learn how to respond to a rape situation. There is a naturally occurring response, and for my client, her naturally occurring response was terror and fear. Now, during the rape, there were lots of other stimuli present. They were in a bedroom, so presumably anything that could be found in the bedroom was paired with the unconditioned stimulus and could then become a conditioned stimulus and elicit a response. But through processing, what she discovered was that black forearm tattoos and the smell of mint were triggers for her, because the man who assaulted her had these forearm tattoos, and he was also chewing mint gum during the assault. And as she recollected, when she was on the quad, she saw other men who had tattoos, and that maybe induced the panic. And at the grocery store, she smelled some mint and induced her panic. So this is interesting in that it can illuminate these triggers, but classical conditioning also teaches us about extinction, and this is the way that people who have some phobias, or people like my client who have some symptoms of PTSD, can actually find recovery. Because we know through extinction, if we're presented with the conditioned stimulus without the presence of the unconditioned stimulus, then our conditioned response is lessened. So if my client were to chew mint gum or smell mint without the presence of her perpetrator, so without the unconditioned stimulus of the rape situation, then the idea is that she would eventually come to extinguish or remove her conditioned response of anxiety and panic. So I hope these 3 real-life examples are helpful in illuminating those 4 concepts within classical conditioning: the unconditioned stimulus, the unconditioned response, the conditioned stimulus, and the conditioned response.